unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. One night in the summer of 2014, two teenage girls living in a remote village in the North Indian state of Uttar Pradesh went missing. Hours later, they were found dead, hanging from a tree in a mango orchard. A media frenzy ensued that propelled the case to the front pages of national newspapers and primetime cable news shows. It was quickly decided that this was yet another clear-cut case of rape and murder in India's heartland. A haunting new book, The Good Girls, by the author Sonia Faleiro, reveals that the truth, however, is far murkier. I'm pleased to welcome Sonia to the show for the very first time. Sonia, congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much.
So I want to begin, before we get into the heart of the book, by asking you a little bit about the sort of motivation. You know, you write in the author's note that you learned about this case, as I think many of us did, on Twitter back in 2014. And in the spring of the following year, you flew to New Delhi from your home in London. You drove 6 hours straight to this remote village of Katra. What compelled you to kind of jump on a plane to make this trip? And what were you hoping to accomplish once you got there?
I had been thinking about writing a book about sexual violence in India. It had been not even 2 years since the 2012 Delhi bus rape, which your listeners may recall quite clearly. A young physiotherapy student boarded a bus. She thought it was a public bus on a cold night in Delhi in December. And the 6 men inside set upon her, they raped her, they tortured her, and they threw her out of the bus. And she died a few days later in a hospital bed in Singapore. And, you know, there have been many, many crimes against women in India, of course. But that particular crime, because the details of that young woman's life, I can't name her because of Indian law, but the details that were published made people, and myself included, feel like, you know, we had lost somebody we knew. And I certainly felt as though that could have been me. And I had grown up in Delhi, anticipating sexual violence, living in absolute dread of something terrible happening. And so I was coming to terms with my own experiences, and certainly with this particular event. And in the summer of 2014, when I saw that picture that you talk about of the two children, Padma and Lalli, I call them in the book, age 16 and 14, hanging by their necks, you know, I was just like, this never ends. And why does it never end? You know, what is stopping us from stopping this? And I thought that this particular case, which everybody said was open and shut because it was believed that the children had been abducted at night when they had gone to the fields, which they used as a toilet, and that they were then raped by dominant caste men and then hanged from a tree, in a show of power and strength. And the alleged culprits were picked up right away by the police. And, you know, everybody seemed to think they knew what had happened. And so I thought, well, I can make this case the centerpiece of this larger study. And really what I was doing in Katra 1 year later, at the time of the first anniversary of the children's deaths, was just talking to a few people. And the thing is that, you know, nothing in India is open and shut because of how things are done. You know, I mean, one question leads to approximately 100 others, you know. And so at the end of that week, everybody was very kind and very gracious and answered my questions. And yet I was not confident that I knew what had happened, even though, Milan, by this time, the investigations had all concluded, right? There was really nothing else for anybody to do. But I didn't feel that I could put this information in a book. I didn't feel that I could back up this accepted story, this publicly accepted story. And so I had these two options, which was I could just find another case, right? Or I could stick with this one. And the thing with finding another case is, it's no different, right? I once investigated a case. I went looking for the case files. I went to the police station, and the person in charge said, the papers have been eaten by the mice, of course. Why do you think I would have them? And so that is it, right? All the papers have been eaten by all the mice. So there is no other case. You might as well deal with this one, is what I figured. And that's what ended up happening.
One of the things that immediately strikes you as you read this book is the person of Sonia Faleiro doesn't show up, right? We get a detailed blow-by-blow account of what may have happened to these girls. We don't fully know with 100% confidence on that fateful day. And of course, the investigation that follows. And so it's sort of not one account, but a blur of multiple, often conflicting accounts. Tell us a little bit about the sort of method. How were you able to report this story, having kind of come in from London via Delhi? You were at this for many years.
Yeah, I worked on this story from 2015 until the 4th anniversary of the children's deaths. It is often the case when you report on a crime like this, especially one of such severity, that the victims' families, and we are very clear that no matter what we think about the case, we know that there are two victims, right? Because two children were found hanging in a tree. But it is often the case, of course, that the victims' families are most likely to talk to you. They are most likely to support you because they believe that by supporting your quest for information, they are supporting their quest for justice. And this case was slightly different because certainly the victims' families, the fathers and mothers of the parents of Padma and Lali, wanted justice. Of course, they loved their children. Padma, age 16, had been asked to drop out of school because her father wanted her to get married. She loved sewing. She loved gossip. She loved chatting on a mobile phone. Lali, her first cousin, age 14, was in school. She loved poems. She was Padma's faithful sidekick. They would go grazing the goats together. And that was that one time when they got to hang out and be normal kids. So they were kids and teenagers in the ways that people in their circumstances are allowed to be, and they were adored. But in the quest for justice, their parents said and did things that were unjust to others. I completely empathize with the circumstances in which they found themselves. They are a farming family in a part of the country that is, by all standards, just at the bottom, right? In terms of, in terms of the economic circumstances, in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of safety. Just their village, Katra Sadatganj, doesn't have power. It doesn't have toilets. It's a situation that really, fills you with despair. So the parents really believed, as they were right to believe, that they were facing an uphill task. And that influenced the choices they made. But because their choices meant that other people were suffering, frankly, it meant that I couldn't always have an honest conversation with them because they could not be honest with me. So, in addition to all the other challenges one faces when you pursue an investigation like this, I had this rather unusual challenge. One way to work around this is, is to respect the choices of people to say what they feel like they have to say, and then to work around them, by talking to everybody else. And so that's eventually what happened. And ended up speaking to more than 100 people, because the people who were central to the story were not reliable. And it wasn't just the immediate family members. The person at the first person to say that the children had gone was a first cousin of the Shakya brothers, Padma and Lali's fathers. And this young man in his late 20s called Nazru just kept changing his story over and over again. And Milan, if I go back to Katra, Sadatganj today, I'm quite sure that Nazru will have a new story for me. So, it was the unreliable narrators, the terrible loss, the great love, and this system that grinds us all under its feet that I had to contend with.
I don't want to give too much away because I want people to read the book, but suffice it to say, and you alluded to this several times, this isn't a straightforward narrative, right? And I kept thinking about the show that I was once addicted to, Law and Order, right? And one of the satisfying things about Law and Order is that there's a very clear beginning, middle, and an end. And the end usually has, 9 out of 10 times, a kind of tidy conclusion, right? Now, nothing in your book has a tidy conclusion. In fact, I think in some of the reviews, it's become kind of a trope to talk about how the book has a kind of Rashomon quality to it, right? Everybody has a slightly different account of what happened. I'm wondering, as an author, at what point did you decide to kind of embrace this as a feature rather than as a bug, right? Because one could see it as, oh my God, there's not a clear reveal here, but in a sense, that really is the central part of your story.
Yeah. I mean, I'm laughing now, Milan, but I mean, I certainly have not been particularly cheerful these last few years, because to go from quote unquote open and shut to every man and woman in the village saw something entirely different really is the most extraordinary thing. And again, perhaps though not all that surprising, because it really, a lot of it really comes down to self-preservation. One of the things that I kept hearing over and over again when I was interviewing people in Katra and the villages beyond was, why just me? Everyone, as in to say, if I would ask a question and say, you saw this, right? You saw it. They would say, why just me? Everyone, which is to say, hey, don't differentiate. I'm not alone. I'm part of a group, and this is a very sort of Indian way of living and a very Indian approach to seeing and expressing oneself, a way of not drawing attention to oneself, and a kind of a, just like I said, self-preservation, because nobody wants to be the one to bell the cat, and there were so many things that were said and done that should not have been said and done. They were not done out of malice, They were done because people don't know any better, or people just, at worst, they didn't care. But nobody wants to take responsibility, and that is very tricky, because it also ties into notions of honor, right? It wasn't just a matter of Padma and Lali dying, which in itself is an immense thing. It was much larger than that for Padma and Lali's parents. It was a matter of their personal honor, the honor of their family, the honor of their village, of their clan. It was, a personal loss became something that involved thousands and thousands of people because of the commentary that people took from the case as a result.
So, Sonia, because you mentioned the word honor, I want to ask you about something that I was going to come to later, but maybe now's a good time to bring it up. You write at one point in the book that you sort of uncover evidence that one of the two girls, I believe it was Padma, was engaged in a romantic relationship with one of the boys who was one of the prime suspects in the case. And that this dishonor brought about by this illicit relationship, I guess you could call it, would have been insurmountable, at least by this generation of the Shakya family. And so the question that were sort of circulating amongst the villagers was, wasn't necessarily why these girls died. It was how they could have lived in light of this dishonor. So if you sort of think about the counterfactual, I just bring our listeners into sort of the sense of honor and status and how this manifests itself in kind of everyday life.
So the families of Padma and Lalli belonged to a low caste, a Shakya caste. They were same as everybody else in their village of Katra Sadatganj, farming people. And, they like people who adhere to the norms of the caste system, follow all the rules. So one of a very important rule of life is to marry within one's caste and indeed within one's subcaste. And that marriage must be arranged by a member of the family, by an older member of the family. So Padma's fathers, their grandfathers, their uncles would have gotten together to decide who Padma would marry. That decision could never have been made by her. Never under any circumstances. And there is no question in a village like Katra Sadatganj of girls having relationships with members, romantic relationships with members of the opposite sex. And indeed, even, talking to a boy is frowned on, is considered suspicious, if not tawdry behavior. Prior to the disappearance of Padma and Lalli, two more girls had disappeared. One from the village of Katra and the other from the hamlet of Jati. Jati adjoined Katra. It was a small, it's a village of huts more than anything else. And everybody in Jati is a member of the Yadav community, which is a low caste community, but considered a dominant caste because in Uttar Pradesh, members of the Yadav community have held political power for many decades now. And indeed, power in the bureaucracy and power in the police as a result. But the Yadavs are no more powerful, at that level than the Shakyas. But the girl from the Yadav hamlet and the girl from the Shakya hamlet who had disappeared had not been abducted. They had, quote unquote, run away. What had actually happened was that they had fallen in love, and the best course of action for them, since they had fallen in love, rather than waited for their, these matches to be arranged for them, was to run away. Because had they remained, their security was not guaranteed. And the security was not guaranteed not by some random lynch mob, but by members of their own family. And indeed, the security of members of their family was also not guaranteed. There is a long history in India of parents killing their children. And this goes back a very long time. Children killed in the womb, children killed as when they are very little. Of course, all girls, and while researching this book, the stories that I learned from villagers of girls left in beating hot fields when they are just a few days old, girls encased in infant girls, encased in these drums that are used for carrying water, and left to die. Or when they're later, or if they're allowed to live, given less food, less likely to be vaccinated, less likely to be given any support, in terms of their education or health. If they live, they live. If they die, they die. So they are essentially considered a burden, and then they make the progress to status of possession. But they are not allowed to choose, and those who choose face deadly consequences. So they're called honor killings, because of course the argument that the killers make, and the killers are often parents, is that their honor is at stake. The girl's behavior determines their honor. So a girl who falls in love violates the family's honor and cannot be allowed to live, because if you allow her to live, they argue, then it means that you accept this behavior. So in a way, what they're trying to say is that by killing the girl who violates the honor code, they have redeemed their honor. So, I can't say to you what would have happened to Padma and Lali. I can reiterate what I know is that they were loved by their family and by their friends and by their community. But, love is one thing in India and honor is another. And as we said before, the concept of the individual is very different in India. If it exists at all, it's very different than what it is anywhere else in the world. The individual represents village, clan, community, religion. The individual is nothing. So, if the girls, for all that people felt for them, could not have known for a fact that they would have been allowed back into their homes, because when they went missing, a search party went looking for them. And then another search party went looking for them. And it's very possible that the children knew what was happening. And obviously one can't say for sure, but the life of a girl in India, it's not in her own hands. It is not in her own hands at any stage of her life, not when she's little, certainly, but not even as an adult. And that is something that I think, is a point that I hope comes across in The Good Girls.
The narrative that you lay out, Sonia, in the book is certainly one about the individual versus the community, about status, hierarchy in society, about honor, but it's also a commentary about governance. And one of the things that comes through time and time again in this reportage is how the law and order machinery seems to have failed in some fundamental way, right? So yes, the police do respond once the girls have gone missing, but there is almost criminal disregard for the crime scene, for conducting timely interviews, for protecting evidence. At the same time, however, the police are, in some ways, portrayed sympathetically in that they're working in really squalid conditions. When one of the officers, who's a character in the book, was first posted in this village, you write, quote, "He was taken aback by the state of the chowki. It looked like a cowshed. The courtyard was choking with weeds. At the water tap, an elderly cook sat on his haunches, rotating a metal scrubber on dirty utensils." Are the police, in some sense, victims too?
Yeah, I mean, I think that everybody who shows up in the book is a victim in some sense. And the police officers, as you rightly point out, their job is to serve and protect, right? There's no argument there. So when the villagers showed up at the chowki, which is a little outpost right in the village, within minutes of Padma and Lali's house, it was the responsibility of the police officers to start looking for them. And instead, what unravels is like a scene out of, I can't call it a comedy, but some sort of horror film, perhaps. It's comedic horror in the incompetence, the bumbling, and also the savagery that follows, there is no excuse for that, right? But at the same time, it's important to contextualize people's behavior, because their behavior stems from something, right? It is embedded in a life that they live because of of what they're given or what they're not given. So in this case, for example, 5 police officers in a chowki in Katra Sadatganj, which is a village of about a family of 1,000 families. Doesn't sound bad, except they didn't just look after Katra. They looked after more than 30 villages. And they did this without modes of transportation. They did this without any technology. There wasn't even, forget computers, there isn't even a phone in the chowki. And, there isn't even a bathroom. There is no place to stay. So one of the police officers, Chhatrapal Singh Gangwar, who was in fact accused of killing the children, when he reached the chowki for the first time, as you point out, he thought, what is this place? And when he was told that he has to live in the chowki, there was no place to live. One of the officers lived in a school. Another officer made do in a health center. So Gangwar just got himself a charpoy and lived in the courtyard of the chowki. So this is not exactly a level of support that inspires a desire to do one's job well. Again, you can argue that that's not reason to not do what you're getting paid a pretty decent, relatively decent salary for, and that is also true. And it's certainly also true that the men in that chowki had a reputation for being alcoholics, that they would just spend a lot of their time with their legs up on chairs, sleeping in the noonday sun, or getting drunk, or chatting with their friends. And it's also true that some people in the village had very good experiences with them, that, when they approached the chowki and they said, my goat's missing, or my neighbor's trying to encroach on my paddy field, they did get help. It just wasn't at the level that improves a person's life or gives them a sense of security. But then one can also make the argument that the police themselves never had that support. They never had that sense of security. Everybody seems to be just doing what they can and hoping for the best. And that's what happened in the relationship between the police and the villagers.
But, in some ways, this is also the reaction of politicians, right? In that it's a constant system of triage in a way, that rather than fundamentally fixing what ails the criminal justice system in India or the law and order apparatus, you recount a veritable parade of politicians who come by, who essentially almost use the scene as a kind of stage to show their generosity in giving cash gifts to the family and so on and so forth. And I'm curious whether you detected in this whole parade of politicians any sense amongst the political class of trying to do something that would genuinely help them, but not just help them, help the village in a more than a kind of Band-Aid sort of way.
I'm sorry to say that I didn't. A lot of people showed up, right? As you point out, representatives of all the major parties, a lot of very familiar faces that the family was very happy to see, whose presence was very comforting to people. And I have no doubt that many of those people were there with the right intentions. They were just as shocked as any of us were to see that image of the 2 children hanging in a tree. Having said that, if you go back to Katra Sadatganj now, you are not going to see any visible difference, not in the way the village works, not in the way that people think. it has, in fact, perhaps become more conservative, more cloistered. It's become, I would say, a more difficult place for young women. There was a nonprofit that showed up that set up, a whole bunch of toilets for the villagers. The outdoor latrines, and but with things, you can't have things without the education, right? So for a lot of villagers who have been going to the fields, whose parents and grandparents have gone to the fields, that outdoor latrine was more like a storage space. So I have been to those latrines and I've opened them, and there was a goat in one, and then there's grain in the other. So there's not been change. That there's sense of that we are small and the system is big is experienced by some, but used as an excuse by all. So there is no reason why, when the most powerful politicians in India descended on Katra Sadatganj in their incredibly expensive and super fancy helicopters, they couldn't all just, figure out one thing, just one thing, that could stop this from happening again. What could that one thing be? We don't know. We can guess. We don't know. Everybody throws their hands up and says, it's insurmountable. The country is too big, it's too unwieldy, and there are too many people.
Another actor, Sonia, in a sense, is the mobile phone, right? And this, to me, was quite an interesting commentary on technology. It was, in fact, the mobile phone that the girls used that may have triggered the series of events that led to their death, but which also accounted for this swirl of gossip surrounding their lives. Many people have written about the smartphone revolution, the untold benefits that it could shower upon ordinary Indians of all stripes. But what does the underbelly of this revolution look like to you?
So Padma and Lalli had access to several phones. They lived in a joint family of 18 people. And like everyone else in the village, there were phones that were being constantly used. And the girls, unlike their mothers and fathers, could read. They could, identify letters and numbers. So they could use the phone for more than just receiving calls. They could text and WhatsApp, and if they had access to the internet, they would have browsed the internet. And coming from their world, which was a world without television, without papers and magazines and books and toys, and no social activities whatsoever, none. They went to school, they came straight back, and that was it. There was one thing they looked forward to all year, and that was the village fair. There was nothing else, right? And these were kids, and they wanted to do the things that kids do. So that phone was the one way that I feel, from talking to family members and from talking to other kids in the village who have phones, it was just a way to enjoy the little time they had to themselves and to keep in touch with people that they liked.
And a kind of form of escapism, almost like a portal to another place, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So they would go to, they would hang out all the time together, but hanging out in Katra Sadatganj is doing chores. It's cooking, it's cleaning, it's feeding the buffaloes, it's grazing the goats, it's working on the crops. But if they were together with their phone, they got a little bit of downtime. What happened with them was that they were with the phone one day and were spied by a villager who didn't even know them. And he saw them talking on the phone. And his name is Rajiv Kumar. And Rajiv Kumar found the site of two teenage girls who, according to, from his point of view, were of, quote unquote, marriageable age, and therefore particularly deserving of scrutiny. He found it extremely unseemly. And he complained to Nazru, who is, the unreliable narrator at the center of the story and a relative of the girls. And Nazru then gets drawn into the story. And starts to surveil the girls, starts to wonder what are they doing, even though he knew that they were allowed to use phones, and even though girls in the village use phones. But to be a girl in the village was to be the focus of everybody's attention, because everybody felt that they had a right to tell girls and women how to behave. Now, the women were cloistered in the house. They generally stayed at home being made to do all the housework. But the girls did chores outside the house, and they watched and watched. And the phone, their one escape from this tough, relentless life, also became a way for them to be scrutinized and to be surveilled, which is what happens when other members of the family start getting involved. And it's sort of like you see this happening a lot. There's new ways and new ideas introduce this sort of whiff of fresh air, whiff of freedom into the life of a young woman in India. And whenever anybody sees that she is enjoying that freedom, just an expression of enjoyment is viewed as such a threat. And as somebody says in the book, why did those men have to interfere? The girls were going to be married anyway, quote unquote. They were going to be married. Why did the men in the village need to interfere? What was it about them using a phone that made those men feel like, they had to complain to the parents, they had to get everybody involved? And as we all know, in India, when everyone gets involved, then it becomes a matter of honor and a matter of scandal. And in order to prevent scandal, people will do anything.
So, Sonia, let me bring this conversation to a close by asking you actually to reflect on this theme a little bit more. You write at one point that reputation was skin. And I thought that was a very powerful phrase in your book. It was, in some sense, a person's most defining attribute, right? And so to me, as a reader, part of this story is a story about the clash between women's voice and agency and empowerment on the one hand, and on the other, sort of patriarchy, conservative social values, tradition, honor. As you kind of take a step back from this particular story and think about India more broadly, are you able to determine kind of where India is along this spectrum of progress?
So, of course, it's hard to be optimistic, having spent so many years inside the system and seeing how everything from our political response to our health services to the state of our police and our criminal justice system is fraying at the seams, to put it very politely. But there is always hope. I mean, just this week, the journalist Priya Ramani won her defamation case against former Union Minister M.J. Akbar. This is a huge landmark. It is a landmark for the women's rights movement in India, a huge boost for the Me Too movement, and it will give women the courage to speak out against oppressors, and indeed it will give anybody who feels like their right to free speech or their other rights are being crushed by powerful forces. So there is always hope, and India is unpredictable.
Well, that is I think the understatement of the year. My guest on the show today is Sonia Faleiro. She's the author of a brand new book, The Good Girls: An Ordinary Killing. Here's what Parul Sehgal of the New York Times had to say about the book. The Good Girls is transfixing. Faleiro does not indict the cruelty or malice of any individual, nor any particular system. She indicts something even more common and in its own way far more pernicious, a culture of indifference that allowed for the neglect of the girls in life and in death. Sonia, congratulations on a terrific read, and we wish you the best of luck with the book.
Milan, thank you so much for having me on.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest-growing podcasting producing platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jonathan Kay. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Maya Krishna Rogers is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.